Yeah. Congratulations on your election and re-election. It's good to see you. Let me ask you what you're hearing about the fiscal cliff, and are you encouraged, for example, by what you heard from John Boehner?
I am encouraged. I don't think there's any way we're going to go over the cliff. We just can't afford to. It would be the worst form of political malpractice. I am encouraged in part by what I hear the speaker say. The only thing that struck me a little bit funny about how he expressed himself was in talking about this being the president's moment, that this was basically his responsibility. This is a shared responsibility. Both the House and Senate leadership and the White House are going to have to come together. Both parties are going to have to come together. These problems are simply too large for either party to solve alone. And I think plainly that's what the country wants us to do.
Well, you heard that one of the things that Speaker Boehner did was he shouted out to the president, "This is your moment." And let me read to you what Gail Collins wrote today. Quote, "In the past, when these things came up, the president's big failing was his inability to hide his contempt for many of the people who occupy Capitol Hill. Now it's a new day, and he needs to be so perpetually and visibly available that the negotiators beg to be left alone." So, what, does he invite everybody to Camp David? Does he lock everybody in the White House? Does he deliver pizza to Capitol Hill? What's your suggestion? What do you think the president can do?
I'd certainly enjoy the pizza, but I think the White House is going to have to engage quite dramatically on this and have to spend a lot of time with congressional leaders. But one thing I think that will facilitate that is to the extent that the GOP leadership up until now had as a primary motivation stopping this president, denying this president a second term, that's no longer an issue. There's no longer that kind of downside in working with the president. So that will facilitate things greatly. We are also under great time pressure. And I agree completely with Senator Reid that we shouldn't kick this can down the road anymore. We've been kicking it down the road for years. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for the country. But I'm also optimistic because when you look at what this country has, we have the same bright, talented people we've always had. We have the same great natural resources and history and ideals and values to lead for another generation, another century, or many centuries. But we have to get our governance together, and I think that's what the American people are saying. And I think on the signature question in terms of the fiscal reforms, the American people have spoken that they do concur with a balanced approach that includes new revenues as well as spending cuts.
Question to the congressman, if I may. I've always thought and heard from people in his cabinet and his Office of Management and Budget people that this president has always wanted real entitlement reform. He believes in it. Have I heard wrong or right on this? Obviously, he wants revenue raising at the same time, but I think that he really understands that Social Security and Medicare do need to be reformed in a way that yes, it has to be politically acceptable within reason to seniors, but there has to be real reform of the numbers.
Well, I think you're right that this is a president who has always taken a look at the big picture and the big challenges. And hasn't shied away from wanting to confront those challenges. At the same time, I think the president recognizes that our immediate fiscal problems weren't created by Social Security, and they have been created by Medicare, and that we need to focus on the most immediate problems to avoid going over this cliff. But there are long-term challenges facing Social Security and Medicare, and in particular, long-term challenges facing our ever-increasing health care costs.
That's what I was speaking of specifically.
And I think that the whole focus that he has had on reforming health care is vital to the long-term health of Medicare and Medicaid, because unless we can control the overall health care costs, dealing with the long-term challenges to those programs will be impossible.
I like hearing all of you be so optimistic. The reality of the election, for as good as it was, and I think surprisingly good for a lot of people, Blue Dogs lost seats. And while the Democrats did very well in the North and the South, a lot of the conservatives dug in. In fact, all 87 super conservatives who were elected in 2010 are coming back. So if it's the fringes of this party who have been torpedoing this deal, Nia Malika, how does it get done?
Well, I mean, I think this is a challenge that Boehner faces, and I think that's why it was so interesting to hear him change his tone. I do think that there was, I mean, if you look at the election, you do see from the poll returns that there is a sense that the president has got some momentum, that a lot of, at least the people agree with what he wants to do in terms of tax reform. So he will likely, I'm sure, not only reach out across the aisle, but also reach out to Americans. I mean, that's something that he's always done, going across the country and sort of ginning up support for what he sees should happen in terms of these big ticket deals. But this, I think both of these men, Boehner, all these men, Reid, who are in control, are looking at their legacies. They want to get something done. They look at these polls which show that the American people do not hold Congress in high regard. They would like to reverse that. They want to have something on their records that speaks to big things. This is a big country. We do big things. We are big ideas centered, and I think that's what they're going to have in mind when they go and look at handling these big problems.
John Boehner's been liberated by this election. He can now really be the leader of the House. He doesn't have to worry about Eric Cantor nipping at his heels quite as much, because the Eric Cantor wing of the party, if the party decides to go the way of Eric Cantor, they are going to self-deport. And I think that's the message of this election. And there are people in the Republican Party, I think, who at last, whether it's Jeb Bush, Bobby Jindal, a whole bunch of people who are going to get up and say gradually over the next 4 years, look, we have to become a fiscally conservative party, yes, but a socially responsible, modern party that understands the demographics and social realities of this country, and quite honestly, that our so-called base and fringe way off there, way out there, they're going to have to be marginalized, or we're going to commit a kind of political suicide here.
The other point that I would make is that while certainly there are many conservatives that hung on because they were strengthened in redistricting in the House, the story of the Senate was the rejection of these hardcore right candidates. The fact that the Republican Party didn't go with the Dick Lugers of the Senate. They went with the Murdochs and the Aikens. I think that was really the story of the Senate was the rejection of those hardcore ideologues and the need to return to more pragmatic elected officials.
Congressman Adam Schiff, good to have